Hey everyone, I'm Noctis Corvus, but you can call me Noctis. Today's video is one that I debated sharing, and, in truth, almost didn't actually record when I had been working on it. Only at the last moment did I decide to record it as a potential video, and to give myself the choice later, though even then I wasn't entirely sure what I would end up doing with it. See, today we're doing a speed paint of an environment, though the inspiration for this came from a slight memory of a dream. So let's just get into the discussion of this then, shall we? This drawing began a short while after I woke up. I did all I normally have to do in a morning, after scribbling this sketch down in a notebook that I keep on my bedside for this purpose. If I hadn't scribbled it down, then I would have likely lost the image, since the only thing I really remembered of this dream was walking through this environment. Yet, I had a general feeling of the dream sketched down and some words next to it that further pushed this idea that I could work from, which is where this all began. As for the dream itself, I had been walking through this old greenhouse. I couldn't exactly say what sort of style it was, yet it was massive, and it seemed as if it never would end, as I was simply walking through its many, many rooms. Most of the walls were made of glass, and the ceilings were of many heights in the many rooms too. Off one main hall there was a branch where the roof was lower and simple. It curved over, and they weren't really large rooms, considering it all. Yet in the larger rooms, the roof was taller and it had more layers. They were domes that all led up to taller points at the centre of the ceiling and the room. I mean, there were some rooms that had balcony levels, and others that had central points that were lower into the ground than the main floor. It really was just an endlessly sprawling greenhouse. In truth, I could probably draw more rooms from this dream as well if I wanted to. I may do it combined with a few other ideas that I have for a later point. Yet the main part I remember is that outside the glass wasn't the normal world. It was instead a sort of void where only darkness remained, and I remember that it was quite similar to space. There were things of stars and sections of colour, as if it was intended to be an impression of space more than anything. Yet it was also simply darkness at the same time. The greenhouse wasn't located anywhere, and there wasn't exactly an entrance or a door that I could remember. I don't even really remember if I was looking for the way out, or the way in, or anything like that in the dream. I was just walking. This part of the greenhouse that I chose to draw is nearing the end of the dream, as it was one of the first things that I jotted down to sketch, as it was also one of the more present things I remembered. The room that I left the dream in was overgrown, and it was so unlike the earlier rooms that I entered in the greenhouse at first. The plants weren't exactly in orderly planters, and there wasn't as much of an order as first assumed given how the start of the dream was. I mean, other rooms were kept and looked after. The plants were more like vibrant flower beds and tall trees that kept to their section of the ground. Each of them saw orderly pathways, and even the climbing ivy was guided and sat in a certain manner. By this point, it wasn't the case. The trees grew from the floor and it broke the tiles around it. There were flakes of broken stone and exposed dirt, and the roots breaking through the layers above, or simply making the ground uneven compared to the more refined rooms. Yet the colours outside the window at this point had also been brighter. There were a few more stars present in the sky, and I remembered that it was wild, yet it felt more natural than the rooms that I'd been in before. It also hadn't broken any of the glass around the room, so it wasn't like it was in a state of disrepair. It was calm, if anything. Of all the rooms, I chose to draw this one, as I remember the tree being somewhat different to those that I'd seen before in it. The main room had a grand giant tree that was impressive for the scale and the size. It was like some sort of grand oak tree sat in the middle of this giant room, and it was sat in the centre with everything around it that kind of guided the eye back to the tree with its age. Yet it was impressive for the things around it and the scale. With this tree, however, in one of the further out rooms, the one kept in the overgrown room so far from the centre, it was more memorable for the ribbons hanging off its branches that moved as if there was a breeze when there was none. The ribbons are things that I added later in the sketches and the drawing process, since, when sketching, I wasn't sure if it would look right with the leaves and the tree, as it was in the beginning. I tied the ribbon around the trunk and figured for a while that I would just leave it at that, but I'll touch on that more a bit later with the detail section, since I had a few troubles with it and the ribbons overall. Either way, I chose this scene for how the tree sat and the ribbons tied to its branches. So, with that choice made, I could start sketching, and I did go through a handful of options at first. The first few were those that I had been trying to include more sense of perspective into them, to maybe have it so that the image is looking up at the tree, or down at more of the room. Yet these didn't happen, as they weren't working out how I'd hoped that they would be. I was trying to capture a sense of the environment more than anything, and testing these new tricks didn't add anything to this image in particular. I figured that, if anything, I would save those developments for another time, and for now, kind of focus on creating a sense of the space that I saw, and I would instead prioritise the key elements over anything else. This is then how we ended up working on this sketch and this process. Even then, I'm going to be honest, the sketch was a guide and a general idea before anything else. I loosely put down what I would want to see with it, and ensured more than anything that I at least had the objects sorted out. I mean, I wanted to be sure I had a sense of the window's frame, the tree, and maybe something loosely in the foreground at the other side of the piece. I kept it loose and never really thought too much about it, and I didn't really want to refine it since I didn't need anything like it. This is why I very quickly went into the flat colours and later colour stages before I'd worked out too much of anything. It's why, as I go along, I ended up arguing with certain areas of visual conflict, and spent longer than normal on the colour palette in particular. It's also why, halfway through, I add things to the piece, like the ribbons I've already mentioned, and some vines between sections of the climbing plants. I know it sounds bad, but I didn't mind for it to be a piece, and this instance, of trial and error. I usually want to work out as much as I can up front, and I usually spend a few hours minimum planning out sketches and the drawings, just to determine if it's an idea that I want to pursue. So this time, it kind of felt good, and was more fun to let go of that control a little bit, and to just say that I'd work it out along the way. And it was even more fun to then deliver on that respect. So, since there isn't much to say about the sketch, let's talk about the colour palette, shall we? The only part of this that I actually really knew, or at the very least thought I would know, had been the patches of colour in the dark background. I figured I would approach it how I would any other time and draw an impression of space. And I would do this by using the watercolour brushes on light blue and pink to create the sections of colour that I was going for. I can then define them more and work with something once I had the basics down. Yet from there I had no other plans for the colour palette, and in the end, even the background colour changed a fair bit in the later stages too. The space details didn't stay this original colour. Yet, whilst the background was still blue and pink, I figured I would try and keep it to the palette that I know. The frame of the greenhouse was done in purple, as I thought it would match the overall space theme of everything else that I wanted to look at, and then kind of kept it to a more natural palette in general rather than going for something too far off the bat. Truth be told, you can probably tell that I had no clue for half of it, since I plot it a lot with neon colours, though it is then why so much of the palette then went to greens and browns to accompany the space-like tones of the blues and purples. I was kind of trying to keep it natural and not be too strange. It then didn't fit. When the floor was a green-grey to try and work with it all, I still didn't think that it worked, and the palette wasn't giving me the same impression that it was in the dream. There was just something off. If anything, this is when I knew that the palette would give me the most trouble overall, since the colour palette was the one thing that I wasn't sure about when I woke up, as I couldn't exactly remember the perfect colours that everything was in that dream to create that impression. I really just remembered the general feeling of the place, so I kept trying new ideas for this drawing. I used a hue correction layer at this point, sort of slide through it, and to see what colours would work best, and this is a habit that I used a lot in this drawing. I just kind of went through it hoping that one colour option would stand out, and hoped that it would catch my eye a little bit more than anything else, and give me that same feeling that I was going for in the dream. And this one wasn't so straightforward itself either. It didn't give me an answer straight away, and if I'm honest, it gave me a few other ideas that I might have been able to trial before I actually came to settle on anything, and even then, I went with a palette knowing that I could change it again if I got to the end and still didn't like it. It would have been a bit annoying, but it wouldn't have been the end of the world, and I've done far stranger before. The first trial palette I did from the hue experiment was a pale blue idea. Well, it was blue, and I thought that I would use a wider range of blues and tones across it, and that was just so I could sort of give it a try. I figured it would be the best way to see if it would work, but I wasn't sold on it once I saw it through. And this is a repeating story. I don't know what it is, but I think if I had to give a reason, it was just a little bit too cold in the blue overall, and that really wasn't the feeling that I was going for. The scene was strange, but nothing cold or off-putting. If anything, the feeling was warm and calm, and it was almost something reassuring. It was something of peace, and the blue wasn't delivering that. So, taking this, I tried a few other ideas until I ended up on this sort of red or orangey palette, and that kept the warm feeling whilst also making a little bit more sense to me. The leaves around bordered on the sense of magic and unusual, but it also gave it an autumn theme to the image as well, which I quite preferred. There is the magic and the unusual appearance that felt right, and also that sense of normality in different aspects. Mainly, the tree is a bit more pink than any leaf that I've personally seen, yet the climbing plants are orange, and it's quite a signature autumn colour that I commonly default to if I want that season. It was strange when I settled on this as well though. As I may have said, I wasn't sure of the colour from the dream, so I had been working off more of a sense and memory of its feeling. The trees were likely green, the plant too, but when drawing it, I couldn't say that it felt right, or was something that I wanted to continue, as there was just that little bit missing from it, and the orange and the warmer palettes had that thing. I mean, when I paired it with the blue as well, it came together slightly, and that was mainly because the blue was an accent, but it was also darker, so it didn't really make it feel too cold with all the warm colours around it. I will also touch on it here, as it works as a good way to start talking about the details too, yet the galaxy in the background also changed a fair bit later in the process. The blues and such worked, but not as much with the new palette. This is where I used an overlay layer in the drawing, just over the galaxy itself, which nudged the background towards purples and pink, that also worked better to complement the palette overall. It was just another area that went through a range of developments and doubts, yet I did manage to settle on this one a little quicker than I did with the overall palette. The galaxy just tended to look good in most colours, and it was interesting the more that I messed with it. Speaking of the galaxy, let's get into the details for the rest of our time here. The background was actually one of the areas I first completed, and I kind of did this before the rest of the image since I sort of have my process for working on it, which simply prefers addressing it overall at once. Once I'd done the bulk of it, I really only went back to it to shift the colours a little bit here and there, and to maybe add some new stars into the space to complete everything once the details on the foreground was done. For the main part, it really is quite a simple process of mixing layers of colours together and blending them out until it is somewhat cloudy and well combined. It can be a balance, don't get me wrong, but after the first few times I kind of worked out how to keep that balance per drawing to get what I needed from it. This time, I first added too much colour, and it was a little bit distracting and too bright overall, yet after adding in more of the black and blending that out too, it brought the balance that I was after, and pushed it a bit further into the background as I wanted. I could then use a different brush to add the lines and the details that still gave it that bit of interest, without making it too much of a focal point. I really didn't want to do my usual and over-detail it all this time. I mean, in the dream it only really became space closer to this section of the greenhouse, and before that it was far more void than colour. At the start there was maybe a single strand of colour to it, and maybe a few stars sparsely dotted around. There wasn't anything to look at, since the greenhouse was the interesting point, and outside simply hadn't mattered. By this point, it was the location, and it was also a kind of setting almost, yet still nothing too prominent, so I wanted to kind of present that here. As such, this is a small detail with not that much to talk about. I gave more consideration to the parts around it and the details inside after all. So let's look at some of those, and it's only right that we start on the tree that made me want to draw all of this. The tree in the dream took up most of the hallway, yet still gave room to keep passing through. It was worth noting that, no matter how wild the plants got, they still left a sort of path, and it was a clear one to follow. It was growing as it wished, and without much care for the stone that it had to break through on the floors that grew uneven around it. It wasn't really at the centre, but more to the side, and that didn't stop it. Its leaves were brushing on the glass, and it was sitting almost against the wall like I drew it here. It's why I kept the framing how it is, the tree to the side yet still undoubtedly the main detail of the piece, rather than maybe moving it or changing it later. The main reason I chose this tree rather than the grander, more refined main hall is the ribbons that were tied to its branches. There weren't many, probably only one or two more than I actually drew, yet they were moving as if there was a breeze when we were inside, and there simply wasn't one. There wasn't anything on the ribbons themselves, they were just tied in the tree below the leaves, and some were entirely hidden by it. I actually considered for a while if I should include them in the drawing, and decided for a fair part of the process that I wouldn't have included it, and just had it been a tree. I had the ribbon tied around the tree trunk, though, and it takes me a while to get that bit right alone. This was partially why the tree stood out in the room, and what drew me towards it, as it was the only one with these ribbons and the one tied around it in the entire place. Part of it almost reminded me of some wishing trees that I've seen though. To be fair, I have also seen the variant of people putting coins into the trunk of the tree for that purpose too, and that variant is a bit more common to me. Yet the ribbons did remind me of that version of a wishing tree, and it drew me towards this one in particular. I did struggle with it though. Even at the end, I considered if they were needed at all, and I wasn't sure even when I started this script if I would keep the ribbons. But we will likely see a decision by the end of this video as to what I chose. I think part of my feeling for them was because I wasn't sure of their palette, which kind of became a significant struggle with them for most of the drawing. I started off on blue thinking that it would fit in with the palette as a stronger accent, yet it was then just too far from anything that I ended up wanting to change it without knowing what to. Purple wasn't right, pink was better but it blended into the leaves, and green wasn't a choice. In the end, I settled on this sort of yellow colour for them, and I liked it a little bit more. It means there's a bit more going on with the tree, which I did like, and the colour settled it a little bit as something that I would maybe be inclined to keep. Besides, when I added them, they helped me solve a point of clashing details that I wanted to do something about, so it is likely that I keep them no matter how strange they may seem in the overall finished thing. This entire drawing is a bit strange, and something more done to preserve this sort of feeling from the dream, rather than anything meant to be my best drawing yet. I almost began to hold it as practice, if that makes sense. Yet, getting back on track, the point of clashing was a major problem I had when I started shading parts of the tree. The leaves are key, and I couldn't move them too much, yet I ended up with a point in the drawing where they were a little unclear against the climbing part on the plant on the window, so it was just looking a bit strange and muddled. I tried many ways of handling it, from adding a layer of shadow between them, a sort of colour tint to the background maybe, to make them a bit more unique, and maybe even tried making the shadows more prominent in this section, so that they stood alone a bit more. In the end, I fixed it with the ribbon. One of them hangs in that area, so it wasn't so much of a problem anymore, though for a while I did have to sit with it and leave it alone until I knew what to do. The more I worked on it, the more I was getting frustrated and unmotivated, so I had to leave it and work on another part of the drawing for a while. In the end though, this area works out. But moving on, the tree was the main part of the image on that side, and it left me trying to balance it on the other as well. I originally planned to do this via bushes and tall leafy plants, yet then decided that I would instead add part of another tree to the side. Yet I kind of made that one as if it was tilted or fallen. It also may have been a larger root from elsewhere, yet it worked well to balance the tree on the other side, whilst not trying to steal the attention of it all too much. Besides, I had fun with it since a lot of the trees had elements of moss on them in the greenhouse, and some were covered with vines and ivy. So for this section, I added a nod to it by having bits of moss along the top, as it also leads the eye into the climbing plants on the window. Yet before we move on to touch on those, the final detail of the trees that I needed to look at had been the roots on the ground. The roots were the main detail to it all, and I wanted to include this. I kind of wanted it to have that nod to what was present in the dream, so I added these details down to the bottom, with patches of dirt exposed where it sort of implied that the roots are what pushed the tiles out of the way, and kind of left little bits of rock and rubble as seen at the edges of it all. I enjoyed the roots probably the most out of the tree details, to be fair. They are small things that I usually skip over in a drawing, yet I always want to include them. When I'm normally drawing a forest, I often forget that the trees have exposed roots around them, and that the ground would be uneven in these areas from this growth. I forget that there can be various shapes at the base of each tree, and it's very rare that the trunk just tends to go straight into the ground when all is considered. This was one time to trial it, and to see how I might remember this detail going forward a bit more if I want to. At the very least, it was something to make this process a bit less intimidating than it sometimes can be when I have more than one tree in the piece. With all of that said, let's move on to the next detail, which is the back frame of the image. This isn't going to be the galaxy, but the actual frame that would have held the windows of the greenhouse. In the dream, they were quite complicated. I started out sketching with the intent to keep the pattern as close to the dream as I possibly could, yet very quickly changed intent and direction. The first detail was the pillars, which I kept quite accurate to the dream. The simple support beams were what held up most of this upper structures, with some help from internal pillars as well in certain rooms. Though, honestly, it was a dream, so structural engineering wasn't exactly the most accurate in this instance anyway. It was about after I drew in the pillars, the base at the top as well as the bottom, as some sort of accent, that I realised the window details would conflict too much with anything in front of them, and that would be especially true if I kept the design in full from the dream. The dream saw spirals, flowers, and all sorts of accents covering rooms of glass, and then one or two where it had been something more simple. Yet here it would conflict, and it would just be a little bit awkward for the overall composition. It meant I took one of the more simple decorations and worked with that in place of the more distracting ones. I kept the curved design along the top and bottom of the window, and figured that it would be a lot of the window design, as I didn't need much more than this. Originally, I was only going to add a dot to certain details of the curves, and then have a sort of thinner beam across the window from these dots in the design. I actually stopped sketching at that point and figured it would be something I either fix later or go ahead with and leave it as something I would like. This is then naturally how I ended up not liking that design and changing it with the flat colour stage. As I have touched on earlier, this drawing had very little planning compared to my normal work and kind of became a practice piece. The window design was simply part of this process, since this was me trying to let go of perfection in planning and simply focus on creating the idea first. The design changed slightly so that there was a dot or detail on every point of the curves, and then the thinner bar only came from the second one in, with the beam at the top for the ceiling too. It was a small change, yet it did more for the balance, since I realised that the spacing of the curves had a double number centre. So if I wanted a single central beam, I wouldn't be able to, and I'd have to put one on each of the central points, which meant I had two central beams, which kind of threw it all off that little bit and it didn't look quite right. I could have made it work, doubling down to the original idea, like I am more inclined to do if I spend hours planning the details. But this time I really didn't mind changing it, and I figured it wasn't the most important thing to try and change other details of the drawings to keep. If I added a design between the two central bars, it might have been nice and worked out, but it would have been busier and more obscured by the plants, and also risked clashing with them awkwardly. In the end, I rather liked the simple frame a bit more anyway. It draws attention to the galaxy behind and the plants hanging around it, which is always what I intended for this to be, and what I wanted to have happen. It's why, despite there being glass slightly obscuring the space outside in the dream, I didn't add any sort of layer or transparency here to give the impression of glass. I mean, I did try a little bit, but it was right at the end and accidentally off camera, and it wasn't really doing me any favours. I say accidentally, since I took a 5-minute break from this before deeming it finished, and then ended up forgetting to record those experiments in general. Either way, I didn't really mind because I didn't use any of them, since the glass ruined more than it added. I'm not sure how to explain it either. The galaxy became fuzzy and kind of looked more like just a black sky than anything. And whilst that was somewhat more accurate, it lost most of the feeling that I had been prioritising up to this point. I suppose this is a long way of saying that I just liked it better without a layer for glass, given my usual process for it. And I have been looking at this drawing since, to kind of motivate myself to find new approaches to draw glass and transparent objects. But it didn't feel right in this use. However, let's talk about the final details for now then, shall we? This is really just the climbing plants, since, so far, I've touched on them but never quite fully explained my logic for it. I've only said that the top corner by the tree gave me conflicts with the leaves, and not why I wanted to keep it, or why I kept working to include this detail rather than just remove it, especially if it had been giving me these conflicts. As I have also touched on, the greenhouse began in a very kept and cared for manner. The plants were trimmed and there wasn't a plant out of place. At the very most, there was a single leaf here or there on the ground, and that was about it from a tree above. For this area, it was more natural and undefined. There wasn't really a planted or designated space for the plants, as they instead claimed all that they could. For the climbing vines here, it was a needed detail to show the wilder side. They climbed the pillars, stretched where they had the grounds to, and they just grew how they wanted. There are strands from them falling and looping between each other into these connected networks of plants, which I really remembered and really enjoyed. It was one of the key details, like the tree, but kind of more in the background. In terms of just the palette, they broke up the building's frame and gave warmth against the sky and the dark frames around them, whilst being a warm, slightly brighter colour that just highlights the plants as the key details that matter far more than the structures and things around it. There is more space for the warmer tones, and it further brings it all into one with the plants everywhere you look in the image. This was the feeling I remembered. I couldn't draw it here due to the angle, and that was partly why I considered other perspectives in the earlier phases, yet there were even plants hanging from the ceilings and covering the whole walls. There were parts of the greenhouse where the moss had covered the stone entirely, and it was more like being outside. I felt that, without the climbing plants, or something similar, it would look as if the tree is a unique instance of breaking through the floor and defying the normal constraints of a greenhouse where things are meant to be purposeful. And I just kind of didn't want that. If anything, it was the last thing I wanted, since it might have began where only 1 or 2 plants were breaking out of the floor and growing how they wanted to. Yet by this point of the dream, by the time that I woke up, it was almost that every plant was just growing how it wanted to. There wasn't a planter in sight, and not even the remains of one. And that is what I wanted to portray with it. That is, however, now bringing us up on time here. I like this outcome overall, and wouldn't have shared it if I didn't. It may not be my favourite, as I intended for it to be very experimental, and something of practice more than anything, since it was something I did rather out of the blue and rather unplanned. I really could have spent longer perfecting it, worrying about detail and perfection before ever getting anything on the page, yet it was fun not to do that for once. Naturally, planning has its merits and the benefits. I won't suddenly stop planning all of my work in favour of this approach, but it is fun to do something like this every once in a while. Besides, it's not even something that I would say or claim to hate. Maybe there are details that I would have changed, the ribbons being one where I would have likely come up with something a little bit better, yet here we are. Anyway, perfection is one of those goals that is just endless. It's always going to be just that bit out of reach. It also is a little bit off topic here, but I enjoyed the easier project recently, and I think that I personally needed something like this, since I have been working more on gifts for my friends, and those are always a little bit stressful, more so than normal, as I hold myself to a higher standard with them because I'm giving them to somebody else. I also didn't give myself a lot of time to work on everything for others this year, yet that is just kind of becoming a pattern if I'm being entirely honest. Anyway, back to wrapping up this video. I liked the break and it was something fun. The idea was fun, and by doing this video it sort of led me to considering some of my other scenes from this dream, and kind of the imagery that I vaguely remember and want to work on more in the future with. So if I do end up doing that, you might be seeing more of this theme and this idea. I can't really say at the moment, I haven't really planned that far ahead. Yet for now, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful week. It means a lot to me that people enjoy watching these videos and like the art that I make. For today though, I will see you next time, and goodbye!